Remember how we talked about intensive versus extensive development when we talked about Jefferson versus Hamilton? Well, the Federalists, remember, want intensive development. That's manufacturing that may lead to social inequality. Well, Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans want extensive development. They want more farms, they want to turn the country more agrarian, and make everyone a little bit more socially equal. Now, the Democratic Republicans win in 1800. Remember, Jefferson becomes president, and Federalists basically disappear by about 1817. But their economic system remains, to a certain degree, and it's aided in part by the presence of Federalists in the Supreme Court, so they're not totally gone. Remember, Supreme Court justices serve for life. So in practice, what we see is a little bit of both of intensive and extensive development in the 19th century, and this is aided in part by the transportation revolution. Right? The transportation revolution changes the agrarian urban dynamic into something that's very different that Jefferson and Hamilton did not predict. So in 1800, about 95% of the population worked in agriculture, right? And that's about 5.5 of the population is about 5.5 million people. Only about 250,000 live in cities. Everybody else lives in rural areas, and almost all of them work on farms. By 1860, only 80% of the population works in agriculture. So now the population is about 31.5 million, but now about 6.3 million people live in cities, right? So still, the vast majority of people work in rural areas, but that urban population is increasing at a very high rate, right? So the cities grew about 23 times, right? 2,300% between 1800 and 1860. So if we look at those cities, in 1800, the three largest cities were each about 50,000 people. In 1860, there are 35 cities at that size, and in 1860, the population of New York City went from 50,000 in 1800 to 800,000 in 1860. So it increased a lot. So this is a lot of intensive development in the cities, right? There is a huge amount of urban growth. As people move into the cities, those cities grow a lot. That's intensive development. That's the development of factories. Those are people who are not working on farms but are working in manufacturing jobs. And here, on the other side of this, is the development of extensive development through western expansion. People are moving west into new territory. In 1860, people live in an area 5 times larger than they did in 1800. In 1860, half of Americans live in a place where there were no citizens in 1790. Just think about that. In 70 years, people moved to a completely uninhabited by American citizens area of the country. Right? So there are two economies in America, and they both are existing. There's both intensive and extensive, and they're both dramatic, and they're both simultaneous, and they're both important. Because the population of America has grown. In 1800, as I said, it's about 5.3 million. In 1820, it's 9.6 million. In 1840, it's 17 million. In 1860, it's 31.5 million. That's a lot more people. And those people need more food, right? Especially if they're living in the city and they're not growing their own food. And people are living further away from each other, right? The food needs to be transported farther to reach the cities and the markets, right? So you have to have people make manufacturing and eat cheaply, right? If you're going to have cheap labor, you have to be able to feed them for not expensive, right? So the food has to be brought in and still has to be cheap. So to have all of this, the thing that makes this growth possible is manufacturing. It is transportation, right? The transportation allows it so you can keep the transportation of food relatively inexpensive. And here is that first example of really important transportation. This is the steamboat, developed in the 1810s and really takes off in the 1820s, and it makes transportation up rivers much, much faster. A trip that used to take on the Mississippi River from New Orleans to Cincinnati used to take 3 months. With a steamboat takes 25 days. So you've cut a trip in more than a third, right? Technology grows very quickly, right? By 1817 you have 17 steamboats. By 1855 you have 725 steamboats operating, right? And it really allows for the development of the area around the Mississippi for farming. It really opens up the area so people can farm there and transport their goods to a market. It can also be used on oceans, and it cuts down the transatlantic trip in half, which allows for people to go to Europe for leisure, and you have more people able to get to America faster, so it cuts down on problems with immigration, so immigration grows up. So because of the steamboat, you have a huge growth in immigration, so because the trip is a lot easier. So in the 1820s, you had about 150,000 migrants per year. In the 1830s, it was about 600,000 immigrants per year. In the 1840s, 1.5 million immigrants arrived per year. In the 1860s, that's 2.8 million people arrive every year, right? Now, these are mostly Irish and Germans. They're looking for economic opportunities. A lot of them go back to Europe. They work here for a few years and then they go back, but they contribute a third of the population growth is because of immigration, right? So the natural birth rate, the people who are U.S. naturals, the people who were born here, they contribute to 2/3 of the growth of America. And partly that's because Americans are marrying early, they're having more children, there's more available food, there's more available land, right? The option is, oh, they can have more children, there's more opportunity for them. Another transportation development is the development of canals, especially the Erie Canal. And the Erie Canal connects the Atlantic to Lake Erie. So canals create roads between lakes that nature didn't create. They can go over hills with locks, and I'll explain a lock. Now, canals take a lot of money and energy and time to build, so they're not something that happens quickly. So it happens gradually, and it mostly happens in the Northeast. In 1816, there were about 100 miles of canals. By 1820, there are 3,000 miles of canals. And you see some pictures, 2 paintings, and then a photograph of a canal. Obviously, a lot of the canals are now filled in, but it used to be the canals were one way of going quickly, and so you didn't have to worry about hills or bad roads, right? The water is always a great road. Especially when it's flat like that. And now obviously we have the Farmington Canal, which you can run on. It's really that tow path next to the water. So a canal works as you have a boat, and then it's pulled along, right, by horses. And so you can see the horses on the side pulling the boats along. And so it goes about as fast as a horse, but it allows people to transport in almost all weather. And here you see a diagram of how a lock works. So you can imagine you're like, well, it's not completely flat between the coast and Lake Erie. No. So what happens is they build the water and then they have this lock system, right? So here is at the top a canal boat approaches the dock, right? And so it has low water as it approaches, and then there's a little bit of higher water at the end of the lock, right? So you pull through, you open that first wider lock, and you pull the boat in between these 2 locks, right? Then the lower gate, the lower lock gets closed. Then you release the water from the other side of that lock in, raises the boat, you open that up, and on you go. And then the canal moves over. That's how a lock works. Another development is, of course, the railroads. This is developed a little later. The first railroad is developed in 1829 as an experiment, and 1830s is when you start to see the time of railroad development, but in the 1830s there's only 13 miles of railroad. But by the 1860s there are 31,000 miles of railroad. Again, mostly in the east, and you can see the map of where the railroads are in 1870. This is obviously a huge development, and it goes much faster than the development of canals. And this is huge for the transportation of much larger items and much faster. Here is a map of all the crossings of canals and railroads in the Northeast in 1870. So you can see how all those lines crisscross all over the coastline of America. And the last important piece of transportation revolution is the telegraph. Right? This obviously doesn't move goods, but it does move noise. Right? It's a machine that transports electrical impulses over wire. And Samuel Morse is the one who develops the Morse code and the telegraph, and it's developed in the 1850s. In 1852, there are only about 50 miles of wire. But by 1860, there are 50,000 miles of telegraph wire because it's very easy to lay down. Right? It doesn't take a lot of workers to lay it down. And the idea is there would be a telegraph office in your local town. You pay a fee, and you can transport a message over to another telegraph office. This is especially good for a business that's commercial, right? You know when things are going to arrive at market. It's good for train schedules. It allows for much faster information, right? For instance, a trip from New York to Detroit used to take 4 weeks. With the railroad, it takes 1.5 days. But with a telegraph, it takes seconds. So you can relay information, what is to them almost instantaneously.